But this, what we're living in right now, can seem like a lot. Sometimes it can even seem like more than what we're able to bear. These down times that we have, though, we need to try to remember that there are some ups that we need to remember. And try to find ways to celebrate when we can. Sometimes those times are harder to find. But you know, going through life, if you don't find a little bit of joy somewhere, you're going to have a long, lonesome life. Even in days of hard work, when you might be doing more manual labor than you ever cared to do in your life, you had to find some times where you could laugh, joke with one another, pick at each other, sing a song, something different to lighten the mood and to try to keep our spirits up. But there's a lot of Christian catchphrases out there, and I may throw a few out that, I don't know, sometimes can be cringeworthy, but one that's really been speaking out to me lately, I heard over and over again growing up. I can't remember the first preacher I heard say this, but I remember the first time it really resonated with me was at church camp when I was a teenager. He said two things I'll never forget. This was in the 80s, and some of you were adults in the 80s, and some of our membership weren't born back then, but in the 80s it was a very high racy, high energy, go, 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 spin, 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 because we didn't know who was going to push the button. And a theme of that day was life in the fast lane. It was a song, you know, everybody wanted to be in the... And I heard the preacher say at youth camp one time, he said, the only thing life in the fast lane will get you is to the end of the road faster. That, I remember that to this day, because that made a lot of sense to my 16-year-old brain. I thought, wow. But the same preacher said this. He said, you need to understand when you're down to nothing, most of the time it's because God is up to something. When you're down to nothing, God's up to something. And we're going to try to be reminded of that as we look at a very familiar passage. We're going to talk about God's plan and how God's plan works out. Do we trust God's plan? Yeah. Does God have a plan? Yeah, He's got a plan. Do we always like God's plan? No. I don't. I don't always like it. God's plan may not always be what we would plan. But His plan is always a good plan. His plan is always to give you a good future. And His plan always has with it hope. It carries hope with it. When you're in His plan, you have hope. And I don't believe any one of us in this building are immune to wondering why. Why this? Why that? Why we face certain struggles in our life? Why has COVID come upon us? Why can't we have life like we used to? But today we're going to see that God can turn whatever situation we find ourselves in where we might ask why. He can turn that situation around for our good. But God goes further than that. He turns things around not only for our good, but for the good of those around us too. For the good of those around us. I think we could all probably look back on our lives and see a few, 2, 3, 4, 5 instances in our lives that if we were to tell a story of our lives, those would be moments we would include to say, this is what got me to this place. This got me to where I'm at today. These things happened, and that resulted in me being where I am. And we're going to talk about one verse today. A testimony from a man in the Bible that's amazing, but it speaks to how God's plan works. And we're going to kind of dig that out and flesh out how God's plan works in our lives this morning from this. It speaks about how your testimony works. Your testimony is important. You need to value your testimony. You need to work for your testimony as far as trying to make godly decisions so your testimony shines. I always like to say, make the decisions today that you want to be able to tell about a year from now. Because what you do today ends up being your story. It ends up being your history. And it gets you to where you will be when you get there. And, I wouldn't be standing here this morning if God hadn't done certain things in my life to get me to where I am. Some of them were blessings and mountaintop glory to God moments, and others were, God, what are you doing kind of moments. But they all work together to get me here. And we find in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, if you've read the Bible or heard very much preaching at all, you're going to hear this verse and you're going to make your church face. You're going to say, oh. Because you're going to remember this one. Joseph here is looking at his brothers. And in verse 20 he says, but as for you, you meant it for evil against me. You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as this day, to save many people. That right there is a testimony. That's a testimony of Joseph, speaking about what God has done and is doing. He is recounting his story, everything good, bad, or otherwise that happened to him up to this point, got him to the place where he is right now. At this point in the story, Joseph is about 100 years old. He only lives about 10 more years, roughly, give or take, after this happens. So he's looking back, and he's letting all the people that are in his presence at that moment, which were his brothers, but whoever was present at that moment, he's letting them know something bad happened, but God was able to turn that around into something good and make it good for him, but not only him, for many people around him as well. To get him to the place where he was, a lot of things had to come together. To get you to where you are in your life, a lot of things had to come together. And some things might have had to have been ripped out in order to get you to where you are today. That's how testimony works. That's how your testimony works, how my testimony works. We share that with people and they see their life in our life. That's how Joseph's life is being laid out here. He's letting us know, he's giving us some of his 2020 vision so we can look back and kind of see what he did and learn from it. But for some of us, though, that may be in the hard part, maybe in the pit like Joseph had been, maybe we're in the dark place, the empty place, the place that's just tough right now. I want to encourage you, God can use even those places. Hope I can give you a little bit of vision on what he's done in Joseph's life, because I don't want you to miss the last half of that verse. So many sermons and so many studies and so many Christians have banked on the first part. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We do that, don't we? We believe that. But so often we forget the last half of that verse. Why did God mean it for good? To bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. You understand what God's doing in your life? He's doing it so you can save people. So you can save somebody's life. Now don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to say that Mike Hoggard can save somebody and take them to hell. But Mike Hoggard can share the gospel and God can save them, do the saving work. My testimony, your testimony is designed by God to save many people alive, to give them life. Somewhere in the future, whatever hard part you're going through right now, whatever empty pit you're walking in, sitting in, maybe you just got to sit in your own bed that you've made. I don't know. Wherever you are, one day in the future, somebody is going to be counting on your testimony. Somebody's going to be counting on watching you come through this in the right way. And the way you come through it is going to either encourage them when it's their time to do it or discourage them when it's their time to go through it. I mean, honestly, guys, can we at least admit we're sitting in a place right here, right now, because in the past there were people who didn't give up on this church. There were people who kept God's vision for this church, who kept loving the fellowship of this church and praying that the Lord bless this church. And even this, there's been some tough times in this church's past, hasn't there? Amen. But even through those tough times, God worked. God taught. And it might have even, I don't know, nobody's ever said this to me, but I just know situations because I've been in them. When you're going through those tough times, you don't feel like you're gaining anything. But after it's all said and done, you've gained more than you know. And if nothing else, people who've been saved because of the ministry of this church have lived up to that verse right there. God brought it all about to save many people alive. Wherever this church has been, whatever issues it went through in the past, whether it was attendance or money, and I don't have any instances in my head. I just know how things work in churches. Every church goes through these things. But because it kept on, because the testimony of this church was held together and the love of this church was pushed forward and the faith of this church kept holding on to God and moving toward God, every person that's been saved since those moments have been saved as a result of this very promise right here to save many people alive. That's why God works through these things. And everybody that's benefiting today from all the stuff that this church does is being benefited this day because of the faith of those in the past. We stand here. I meant to look on the plaque when I came in, how many years ago it started. But all these years later, because folks just kept going, kept having faith, kept following the Lord, even in difficult times. And Joseph here, Joseph sort of lets us know that our testimony is an investment that God makes in our life. God does things in our life so that we can share them with others. And Joseph here starts out looking at his brothers and he says, "You meant it for evil." Don't miss that. What did they mean it? They meant it for evil. That was the meaning of it, right? But then he says, well, I guess we need to talk about what, just to be sure. What happened to Joseph? Joseph was favored by their father. Okay? He was not the eldest, but he was treated like the eldest. He had the coat of many colors. The Bible talks about it as it's just made of really all the best pieces of fabric that were in the household was made into this coat. It was a coat of honor. It was to give him a position of honor and authority and dominion and all that stuff, to prove that this coat or this tunic or what have you, it was given to him by his father to show the whole family, hey, I love him and he holds a special place in my heart. He had dominion. He had some authority. This coat represented his authority in the family, that like he'd been handed over some rights. The firstborn rights, the eldest's rights, were given to him. So he was given all this. Even though he wasn't the firstborn, he was given all that. So inside he knew where he stood with his family, where he stood with his father. This coat was just an external representation of what he already knew on the inside. But not only did he have this coat, Joseph had this dream. And he dreamed that his brothers would end up bowing down before him. And bless his heart, he also had a little bit of ignorance because he shared that dream with his brothers. And that made him mad. And boy, they didn't like it at all. And then they threw him in a pit. We're going to kill him at first. They threw him in a pit, and then they decided to sell him and make some money on him. You know, while he was sitting in that pit, the Bible talks about that pit. Now, it's Genesis 37 where all this takes place. In that pit, wasn't even any water in it. There was no good thing in that pit. He was sitting in there all to himself with his brother. His brothers had thrown him in there. He didn't know that in Matthew chapter 25, Jesus would teach about the good steward who would do well and take care of the talents of the master and all that. He didn't know that, but he remained faithful to the Lord in whatever he did anyway. When the brothers saw his tunic, what did they do? Verse 23, it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of the tunic and the tunic of many colors that was on him. They took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. When they saw that tunic, isn't it interesting? All the stuff they could have done, why did they tear the tunic off of him? Why did they take the tunic? Because the tunic was what represented his love, being loved by the Father, his position in the family, okay? And they didn't want Joseph thinking they were going to bow down to him. They didn't want Joseph to experience this calling on his life, this blessing on his life. And we read this passage, he's thrown into that pit. He's being pulled away from his father's favor. They stripped him of the external evidence of his father's favor. He was thrown into a pit, and in that pit there was not even the simplest things that he could need. There wasn't even any water in it. It's empty. He's alone. He's in this place, and they've stripped him of the very thing that represented his favor, his father's favor on his life. Why? You know, they were trying to take him down a peg. They couldn't take his dream away because he'd already had that dream. And the dream that he had was internal. But because they couldn't reach into his brain and strip that dream away, that favor that he had received from the Father already, they decided to strip him of all the evidence of his Father's favor. They took it away from him so that he would not feel that anymore. He wouldn't be able to see it. They tore it off his external body, even though it couldn't touch what he had in his mind. And that's how the enemy works, guys. That's how the devil will work on you and me. John chapter 10 verse 10 says the enemy comes to kill, steal, and devour. Okay, that's what the enemy comes to do. That's all he's about. He wants to take your testimony away from you. I told you your testimony is God investing in you so that you can show other people the way to life, so you can save a life with your testimony. You can guide them to the light who was the light of men, Jesus Christ. And what the devil tries to do is damage your testimony in a way that he can strip you from all the external evidence of God's favor on your life. He can't take away your internal favor, your salvation, what God's done for you in your soul, and you can remember it with your mind. But he can strip you of things that are on the outside so that people might look at you and think, well, they're no longer in God's favor. But sadly, what he really is trying to do is to get you to believe you're no longer in his favor. Okay? So you'll feel like you've lost God's favor in your life. They stripped his tunic away so that maybe his external evidence of the Father's favor would be gone. Satan will work to take your job, your finances, your home, your family, your whatever it is that you might have that you attribute to God. He will work to try to take that away so you can feel like, well, God just don't love me anymore. I'm out of favor with God. But if the enemy can make you feel like you've lost the Father's favor, he can make you act like you don't have the Father's favor. If he can get you to believe it, then you'll start acting like it. As long as you're acting as though God is favoring you, and don't get me wrong, that's not a prideful feeling. That's just knowing Jesus saved you, you've trusted in His Son, and you're banking on the promise of Jesus that if you're saved, you're going to go to heaven and God favors you because of what Jesus did. Okay? But if He can make you think that God's against you, so many Christians today walk around waiting for God to whoop them. I mean, they're just waiting on God. God's got to be mad at me. I've done something to make God mad. Something's just wrong. And that's Satan working to take us out of God's favor, because if we feel like God doesn't favor us anymore, He don't care about us, He's angry at us, He doesn't love us as much, then it's a whole lot easier not to follow Him. It's a whole lot easier not to listen to Him. That's what the enemy did with Job, if you'll remember. You've read the story. Satan took his house, took his family, put boils on his skin, took most of his money. He did all of these external things to Job because he was trying to do something internally inside of Job. What was the devil's desired result? Job, you need to deny God. That's what he wanted. And he worked through these external means. He was stripping all these good things away that were in his life so that Job would think, I'm out of God's favor. And if he can get us to thinking we're out of God's favor, then it's not a very far step to say, well, I'm just going to deny God and do what I want to do. Satan's purpose is to get me to denounce God. Now, he might not get us to say, I denounce God or whatever, but he can make us act like we denounce God because we don't listen to God. We don't do what God says. We don't live by His Word. We put our word and our feelings and our thoughts before God's Word and God's feelings and God's thoughts. We put our stuff before His or someone else's stuff before His. And is that not denying God? Sure. Not maybe with that staunch, just say it like you mean it, but it's doing it by your actions. He wants to get us to denounce God, to think God is not as happy with us as He once was. And He will do things like strip away external things to just understand. When you start losing these things like that, that's just a vehicle Satan is using to get inside you, to get inside your heart, inside your mind, whatever you want to look at it, to get you to deny God, to get you to denounce God. That's what he did to Job. And when you think about it, that's what he did to Adam and Eve too, in the garden. God placed them there and said, don't eat of that tree. And Satan said, look at that fruit over there. Isn't that nice looking fruit? Don't that look good? He got them to think about these external things, but the purpose of focusing on these external things was so he could get internally, inside. Get to them inside. Why did he do it? To mess up the world. You know, he did it with Jesus too. He did. Matthew chapter 4. The devil was saying, hey, you're hungry. Turn this rock into bread. Oh, you see all these kingdoms? I'll give them to you if you'll worship me. That was the true thing. To denounce God and worship me. Just bow down and worship me. The devil is always trying to do something in our external world that will affect our internal world. He's wanting to strip away all the blessings of God, the favor of God, so that we can doubt the providence of God. And we need to understand, guys, sometimes we need to be reminded, yes, God does bless us physically, doesn't He? Sure He does. Sure He does. But God's main focus is not the physical. He's not the physical. His main focus is the spiritual kingdom that He's building us up into. So, but just because you might lose some of the external evidence of God's favor, of the Father's favor, doesn't mean that you don't still have the internal providence of God within you. They stripped that cloak, the coat of many colors, they stripped the evidence of the favor of His Father off of Him. But that didn't mean He still wasn't favored. He was still favored if he could just remember that on the inside. Even though he didn't have the blessing on the outside, the favor was still there. And that's what we're seeing. That's why I'm bringing this up in Genesis chapter 50 this morning. That kind of gives us a clear vision based on Joseph's testimony. This isn't a pie in the sky thing that we're just making up. Joseph said, this happened to me. You know my story. This is what I learned from it. This is my testimony. And if I'm in a dark place, if I'm sitting in a pit wondering where all the God's favor and the physical things of my life are gone to, and I'm wondering if God still has favor on me or not, you know what? Joseph's testimony can give me life. It can give me life. It can save me alive. What do you mean? It can restore my soul. It can build up my faith even more than it was or would have been without it. God has a testimony for your life. God has a purpose for your life. And guys, we're not here this morning randomly. God had a plan for us to be here today. And it was not to just come sit and soak and sour here and hear the word and soak it up. And we don't live in a random world. God cannot possibly create the entire known universe, this self-sustaining world where plants consume what we breathe out and expel what we breathe in so we can continue to live and plants can continue to live. God can't do all this organization, getting all of these things working in unison to help one another, and then just create us for some kind of random purpose. He did it all with a design. Your life is in a design. It's designed by God. Can you make decisions that go against the will of God for your life? Absolutely. Absolutely. But God can even use those. Amen. He can use those decisions for our good. I often say He sometimes uses us in spite of ourselves. He can do that. No, you're not random. This was a purpose. God has a purpose for your life, or you wouldn't be sitting here today. But what the enemy wants is for you to think, for you to just think otherwise. The enemy wants you to think that God doesn't have a plan for you, that you can't possibly be used, whether you're young, whether you're old, whether you're sick, whether you're well, whether you're man, whether you're woman, whether you're employed or not employed, whether you have this ability or this disability. He wants you to think that God can't possibly have a plan for you, that God is against you when He wants to put you in the pit. Oh, I'm not going to make it. I don't know how I can get out of this. I'm not really sure if I can get out of it this time. I don't know. What He really wants to do is get you to a place where you think, you know what, I don't know if God has my back or not. I heard someone say this one time, and boy, it sounded real spiritual, but now I wonder. You know, God's delivered me in the past, but boy, if I keep getting in spots where He has to continue to deliver me, He may stop delivering me, you know. That's garbage. God will never fail you. Okay? He'll never fail you. I don't know if He's got my back or not. I feel forgotten. I feel like He's just leaving me out here hanging. This isn't for me, I don't guess. Can't see what God's doing in my life. My spiritual vision seems to be fuzzy. Everybody else is getting their stuff and I'm not getting. Just recognize that's a tactic of the enemy on you. He's trying to get you to doubt. He's trying to strip away some of the external evidence of the Father's favor. I'll tell you something, just like Joseph, when they tore that coat off of him, he might not have looked favored by his father, but he was still favored by his father. Still. And all of the stuff, the blessings of this life could be taken away, but that does not mean you are not highly favored. That does not mean that God is not still watching you, still concerned about you, still looking over you, still trying to lead you, still there for you. It doesn't mean that at all. But Satan, the enemy, wants you to think, well, he just don't love me anymore, so I'm just falling away, I'm no good. But that's what this Genesis chapter 50 is here to remind us of. That's what this testimony is here to remind us of. And that's what your testimony in the future could remind folks of as well. I was a big fan, and I guess still am, of superheroes. I watched all the superhero movies and TV shows growing up and everything. I always have loved them. But you know, when you think about a superhero, what kind of movie, what kind of story would you have if there was no villain? If there never was a villain, if there never was a problem. If all you had was a movie about Superman and all he could do was just kind of nothing, there wasn't anybody to fight, you might sit back and think, well, that's kind of a dumb movie. There's got to be a villain. There's got to be a problem. There's got to be an issue. That's where the super comes in. And the reason why we know that we serve a superhero is because we're still here. This church is still here after so many years, so many struggles, so many trials, is still here. There were problems that occurred, yet God worked through and God directed and redirected. And it says in the passage there, if you'll remember, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We're talking about the same thing, aren't we? When he says that, we're talking about the same instance. It's the same situation. This same situation you meant for evil, God meant it for good. God actually changed the meaning of that experience. The experience didn't change, but they're talking about the same instance, and God just changed the meaning of the instance. He's a meaning changer. You've heard people say, He gives my life new meaning. He does. He does. But He can also change the meaning of the things that happen to your life and change them. What do we say? Turn your problem into a praise. He can do it. He can do it. That's our God. He takes our tests. He turns them into our testimony. He can take our mess and turn it into our message. He can use our all the things that have happened to us in the past. Heard a new one this past week. What was it? He can take your misery and turn it into your ministry. Because nobody can minister to people in the way that if you've been through the same situation, you can minister to them in a way that other people can't. Mary and I didn't know why we lost so many babies and couldn't have a baby, but we've been able to minister to people who went through the same thing. Would I go through it again? No, I'd like to have a baby. But God took what happened and He changed it into a ministry. He changed it into something better. Why did He do that? Do you think God would allow something like that to come into my life just so I can work to save somebody's life? Yeah, I do. Because we said a while ago, we believe that God does bless us physically, but His ideology, His focus is not the physical, it's the spiritual. And if we can save people spiritually, He'll let us go through things physically in order to get there. And He did that for Joseph. Joseph, in chapter 37, verses 41 and 42, Joseph was stripped. But we see he was stripped in chapter 37 by his brothers. He had the robe stripped off of him. But in chapter 41, verse 41 and 42, we see the Pharaoh takes off his signet ring, puts it on Joseph's finger. Pharaoh takes the royal robe and puts it on Joseph. Pharaoh takes the necklace off of his neck and puts it on Joseph's neck. Now, the necklace, the royal robe, the signet ring, and all that, all those things were to show, well, they were signifying Pharaoh's authority. And he was giving that authority to Joseph. What those things said was, buddy, anytime you walk into a room, anytime you walk down the street, when they look at you and they see these things, everybody's going to bend the knee. They're going to bow before you. Joseph had these dreams and he shared those dreams, and those dreams are what got him stripped. But those dreams were also God used those dreams to get him equipped. Yes, he was stripped by his brothers. God might allow us to go through a stripping, okay? But He does it so that we can be equipped. He's equipping us to continue living out our testimony. And that's why I was reminded, I think, of what that old preacher said when I was at youth camp. Understand when you're down to nothing, it's because God's up to something. God's up to something. We need to understand we're going through what you're going through right now. You're going through it for your testimony. For your testimony. Somebody's life. Genesis 50:20. Joseph said, "You meant it for evil, God meant it for good, so that all these lives would be saved." Somebody's going to look at your testimony, and your testimony may save someone's life. Maybe not physical life, but it might save their spiritual life. It might help them continue to focus on God. So I want to say this. Keep going in your story. Don't give up. When you're being stripped of all the favor of God on the outside, just know you're a favored. You're highly favored. You're favored and you're loved. Joseph tells his brothers here, you meant it for evil. Brothers, that action, you know what? You were evil. You were evil when you did that. But don't worry. It's okay. Because God meant that thing for good. God used all that for my good. So God equipped him even though he'd been stripped. You get it? These things may be taken away from you, but God can use it to equip you for something in the future. Even if it's just equipping you to be able to identify better with somebody. To be able to help someone in a way that you couldn't before. How else did God? I want to show you how else God took that scenario and made it good. You ever wonder why we're so passionate about things that that have happened to us? Why people are so passionate about things that happened in their past? Often, our method of ministry comes from past misery. That's why my heart goes out to people who have had miscarriages and stuff we've experienced. Others have a good friend in the ministry who was addicted to crack and living for the devil, doing whatever. He went to rehab and he got off of it. He went to jail, but he got off of it, got saved. Now he's following the Lord. But he's got a heart for people that are on drugs. And he's reaching out to them, trying to introduce them to Jesus because he knows what Jesus did for him. And he knows he can do it for them too. People who have lost a spouse have a different heart for others who've lost spouses. Our ministry often forms out of our own misery. God actually takes something... I don't even know what a good word is. It's horrible, but I don't know if that's the right word. God uses what turned our lives upside down so that we might actually be able to give life to somebody else from that. A lot of this really starts making sense. I think we can really start living this out when we finally come to that understanding that life is not all about you. Life's not all about me. I've said it in the past, we are not the stars of our own movie. We're supporting actors in a movie about God. That's what we are. And these things happen to us and they start building up around us and happening to us over and over again. And we can sit around and just think how terrible they are and how God could hate us. He must not love us as much, or we must have fallen out of favor with him because we've got all this stuff taken away from us that was once good and now it's not anymore. But we need to start working to forget that. Remember, Joseph's coat was not his father's favor. Oh, it was an example of it, but he still had his father's favor. How can we do that? How can we forget things? Ladies seem to be thinkers, right? They're thinkers. They like to think through things and they dwell on things. God designed them that way. God designed men the way we are as well. When you think about it, men had to go off in battle and do whatever had to be done to protect their family. And then after the battle was over, the man had to come back home and still be loving to his wife and loving to his kids. Now, ladies wonder, how can you compartmentalize? How can you not think about God made us that way so we could do that? Ladies were made the way so that they can remember things and think about stuff. Listen, when the man had to go out for days at a time looking for food or shelter or whatever they might need back then to protect their family, the wife could sit and remember how their husband treated them over and over again, how good he was to her. And she could rest in that. She could remember that and keep her going until he was able to get back home with whatever provisions that he found, whatever he could. God designed us that way. So we look at things differently, we think about things differently, but it's all made by God and designed by God. And one thing I know, people ask me, how can you forget certain things? How can you move beyond certain things? How can you turn a misery into a message or a ministry because it hurts so bad? You can forget pain. That don't mean the pain is gone or the pain never happened. You can look at it differently, though. You can. Ladies, you can. And here's how I know. I know many ladies who had a child and went through hours and hours and hours in the hospital. Might have even almost died. I don't know. But you know what happens a year, 2 years after they go through that? A lot of them's ready for another one. They're ready to do it again. Do they not remember what happened before? Do they not remember the pain? Do they not remember the struggle? Yeah. You know what I found people talking about that? One of the best answers I ever hear wives give about that, Yeah, I remember it. But that baby, though. Right? That baby, though. It's worth it. Amen. It's worth it. You do it all again. So that baby that you're looking at overrode all the struggle, all the pain of the birth. And so we can remember the struggle, the misery, and all that. But when God finally delivers that baby into your life, the blessings of that are better than any of the struggle it took to get there. And when we have a struggle in our life and God works through that struggle, that misery, or whatever it is, and God delivers into your life something that's life-giving, you know what? We can look at it and often we'll just say, oh, you know what? It was worth it. It was worth it. That's why I can say, man, I don't want to go through crushing my fingers. I wouldn't do it again for nothing. But I'm glad it happened. I'm glad it happened. It needed to happen. And God, that's a testimony. That's a testimony. So it's good that God can take the situation that was bad and actually change the meaning of it. And God may be trying to do something in your life to bring about something better. He may be allowing a struggle in your life to birth something even greater in your life. To produce some kind of fruit that down the road will give somebody life. So I want to encourage you in all this. Don't quit. Don't give up. Don't allow the enemy, when he is stripping the external appearance of God's favor out of your life, don't let him succeed at getting to the internal thinking and your heart and get you to doubting. Because he can't win. He's been defeated. So we don't need to let him take us down. Don't throw in the towel. Don't quit. Don't. If we quit in the middle of God building this testimony within us, if we throw in the towel, then in a sense we've allowed the enemy to win because he's kept us from getting the testimony that God has for us. And don't let him take you down. But most of all, remember this, guys. You have not lost God's favor just because some evidence, physical evidence of God's favor is gone. That don't mean you've lost God's favor. No. Losing a job is not losing God's favor. Losing a home, losing a vehicle, losing a spouse, that's not evidence of losing God's favor. Because physical evidence does not override God's spiritual providence. Doesn't. So don't get it messed up in your head. As you're going through this life and you're going through the struggles that you may be going through right now, just know this, you got to keep going. Just keep going, because somebody's life can be saved based on your testimony. By watching you make the right decisions, by watching you continue to follow the Lord, their life could be changed too. Their life could be saved. The decisions you make today will determine your story 10 years from now. That's how you live it out, guys. Make decisions today that you want to be said of your story next year. Sometimes we want to quit. Sometimes we want to move on. But don't quit. Give God the opportunity. Be patient. Whatever pit you might be in, whatever emptiness you might feel. Instead of saying, hey God, I don't want to be here anymore, maybe we should say, hey God, why do you want me here? Why do you want me here? And God, I know you've got a peace you can give me that surpasses all understanding, so I'm ready for that. God can use all things. God works all things together for our good, right? We know that. We believe that. It's hard to see or hear when we're going through it at the time. You meant it for evil, brothers, but God meant it for good, so that many might be saved. We have a chance to succeed and gain a testimony. We have a chance to falter and let our testimony falter with us. But God has a plan. He has something He wants you to do. He has a reason for allowing things to happen in your life. And it's His plan. And it may not even... We know His plan is to give you a hope, to give you a future, to give you an expected... We know that's His overall plan. It might not be your plan, but it's a good plan. It might not even feel like a good plan at the time, but it's a good plan. It's a good plan. The greatest need of all of our lives is forgiveness of sins, and that is given through Jesus Christ, God's one only begotten Son. And that's what gives us the future. That's what gives us the hope that He died on the cross for our sins. That's what gets us there. So whatever guilt that you're carrying, whatever guilt you have for what you've done or what's going on, whatever fear you have over what's happened in your life, what you've done, Jesus Christ is here to forgive you of that. He's here to encourage you from that. If you'll confess your sin, trust Him, ask Him to forgive you, man, He'll do it on the spot. He'll give you eternal life. If you're not saved, He'll give you what you need to live forever. He'll put His Holy Spirit within you. But He'll also give you a life here, a life to enjoy here. I don't know. I can go through a lot if I know God's favor is on me, that He loves me, that He's there for me. I can go through a lot. That's why Satan works so hard to get that understanding out of my head, to block that from me, to get me not thinking that way. So I guess, child of God, if you're saved, the big deal that I want you to get out of this morning is, know you're favored by God. He hasn't quit you. He hasn't given up on you. He's there. the physical evidence of whatever that you might look at thinking, oh, this is proof God has favored me. He gave me this. His blessings are on my life. Even if those things are gone, He still loves you. He's still there to bless you. And He's still watching over you and all the stuff that He's allowing to happen in your life, if nothing else, might be used to save somebody else's life down the road. So, I often say, and I think we believe that if God did nothing but save us, that's more than we deserve. But He does so much more. So when those things maybe fall away or go away or whatever you want to call them, just because those physical things aren't there anymore, don't forget His love for you is still there. He saved you. And not only that, He saved you, and He's actually using you to save others. That's our amazing God. Isn't that something?